In the spring of 1945, on a scrap of volcanic rock 300 miles from the enemy's homeland, a young American pilot, call him Jack, is handed a book. It is bound in dull card. Across the top of the cover, stamped in heavy black letters, is a single word that follows it onto almost every page inside. The word is restricted. Below it, a number. Army Air Forces Manual 51-127-4, and the silhouette of an aircraft so large that at first glance it scarcely looks like a fighter at all. This is the pilot training manual for the P-47 Thunderbolt, and in the hands of the man about to fly it, it is something closer to a survival guide. Because the mission waiting for him is one of the longest, loneliest, and most punishing flights a single-seat fighter pilot will ever be asked to make. 8 hours, 1,500 miles, there and back, across the largest ocean on Earth, to escort a stream of bombers over the islands of Japan. No second engine, no co-pilot, no place to land if something goes wrong. Just one man, one machine, and the knowledge written into the book on his knee. So how do you keep a man alive out there? The answer begins not in the cockpit, but 5 years earlier, on a train, with a single drawing. To understand the manual, you first have to understand the machine. And the machine began as an argument the Army did not want to have. In the spring of 1940, a Georgian émigré engineer named Alexander Kartveli sat aboard a train bound for New York, sketching. Kartveli had fled the Red Army as a young man, studied aviation in Paris, and crossed the Atlantic to build aircraft for a company that would become Republic Aviation. The Army Air Corps had just told him that his existing fighter design was finished, that what the service truly needed, watching the air war unfold over Europe, was something that could climb higher, fly faster, and survive longer than anything in the sky. Kartveli started over with a pencil. What he produced broke every convention of fighter design. He proposed building the largest single-engine fighter any nation would field in the entire war, an aircraft so heavy and so broad-shouldered that his own team had doubts. Kartveli waved them away with a line that would follow the aircraft into legend. It would be a dinosaur, he said, but it would be a dinosaur with good proportions. At the heart of his dinosaur sat one of the most powerful aircraft engines ever bolted into a fighter, the Pratt Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder air-cooled radial that produced more than 2,000 horsepower, and which, by the time the N model rolled off the line, could deliver well over 2,500 with water injection forced through it. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 great rings, it was a triumph of brute mechanical engineering, and at full throttle it did not so much run as detonate, a controlled rolling thunder that gave the whole aircraft its name. But raw power was not enough. To rule the thin air above 30,000 feet, where the bombers flew and the enemy waited, the engine needed to breathe. And at that altitude, there is almost nothing to breathe. So Kartveli built the Thunderbolt around its own lungs. A massive turbosupercharger was mounted not behind the engine, where you might expect it, but far back in the belly of the fuselage, near the tail. Air was rammed through nearly 20 feet of ducting that ran the length of the aircraft, compressed, cooled, and fed forward to the engine, restoring at altitude the power it would otherwise lose. The system was so central to the design that Republic's engineers did something almost unheard of. They laid out the ducting first, and then built the entire airplane around it. Everything else, the wing, the cockpit, the guns, had to fit around the path the air would take. The result filled the belly of the fighter with machinery, and that machinery, it would turn out, did more than make power. It would also save lives. But that is a part of the story the manual treats with great care, and we will come back to it. For now, return to the pilot and to the book. The Thunderbolt he is about to fly weighs, fully loaded, more than 10 tons, heavier than some twin-engine bombers of the early war. Walking up to it, a pilot does not so much climb into the cockpit as climb up onto the aircraft, hauling himself along the broad wing route to a canopy that sits high above the ground. The machine has a nickname by now, earned across 2 years of war on the other side of the world. The Jug. Short, depending on who you asked, for juggernaut, or simply for the fat, bottle-shaped fuselage. The manual does not waste time on romance. It is written in the plain, almost conversational voice of an instructor who wants you to come home, and it begins where every flight begins, with the problem of waking up that enormous engine. The first instruction in the starting sequence is not a switch or a lever. It is a command, shouted out of the cockpit before anything else happens. Clear. Jack calls it to the ground crew and waits for the acknowledgement, because the crew chief may be adjusting a chock, or may have wandered off, leaving no one standing by with a fire extinguisher. And on a machine with this much fuel and this hot an engine, that matters. Only after the answer comes back does the ritual begin. The ignition switch goes to both. The starter is energized, the great inertia flywheel spun up for 15 or 20 seconds until it howls. Then, in one coordinated motion, the pilot engages the starter and works the primer, feeding raw fuel into the cylinders. The 4 blades of the propeller, broad, paddle-shaped things added late in the Thunderbolt's development to claw more thrust out of the thin air, begin to turn. They stagger, hesitate, and then the double wasp catches with a cough and a blast of blue smoke, 18 cylinders hammering into life, the whole airframe trembling around Jack like a living thing. He nudges the mixture control forward to auto-rich, holds the engine at a fast idle, and lets it warm. The book is matter-of-fact about all of this, but every line of it has been paid for in someone else's mistakes. Before the Thunderbolt can fly, it has to be steered to the runway, and even this the manual treats as a skill to be learned. The Jug's nose is so long and so deep that, sitting on the ground with its tail down, the pilot cannot see directly ahead of him at all. The world in front is simply blotted out by the cowling and that enormous engine. So he taxis in a slow zigzag, swinging the nose left and right with bursts of throttle and rudder, snatching glimpses of the ground between each turn, a crewman sometimes perched on the wing to call out anything he cannot see. At the end of the runway, he runs through the cockpit check the book has drilled into him until it is reflex. Controls free and moving correctly, instruments alive and reading true, fuel drawing from the right tank, trim set, propeller and mixture where they belong, canopy and harness secure. Above him on the panel sit the gauges that will rule the next 8 hours of his life. Manifold pressure and engine speed, fuel and oil, and the oxygen supply he cannot live without once he climbs into the thin, killing cold of high altitude. There is no margin out here for a forgotten step. The check is not bureaucracy. It is the difference between a routine he can repeat tomorrow and a column of smoke on a coral island. With the engine running, the manual turns to the systems that will keep the pilot alive once he leaves the ground, and the first of them is the one that makes the Thunderbolt what it is. As the aircraft climbs and the air thins, the turbosupercharger spools up, ramming compressed air forward through that long belly ducting. But compressing air heats it, and hot air robs an engine of power, so before it reaches the cylinders, the charge is run through an intercooler, its temperature managed by a set of doors the pilot can open and close. Feeding the engine its fuel is a Stromberg injection carburetor, which the manual praises as one of the great mechanical achievements the war produced. A device that automatically meters exactly the right amount of fuel for the mass of air rushing through it, across every altitude and throttle setting the pilot will ever use. He selects from 3 positions on the quadrant: idle cutoff, auto lean, and auto rich. Get it wrong and the engine stumbles or starves. Get it right, and the Thunderbolt simply keeps pulling, higher and higher, into air where its rivals are gasping. This was the Jug's true kingdom, the stratosphere, above 30,000 feet, where the turbo-supercharger gave it a strength its enemies could not match. In Europe, this was where it had first made its name, diving on German fighters out of the sun with a speed that pressed pilots into their seats. But altitude was only half of the problem the manual was written to solve. The other half was distance, and distance had very nearly killed the Thunderbolt's career. Here the story doubles back. When the Thunderbolt first went to war over Europe in 1943, it was, for all its power, a fighter with a humiliating flaw. It drank fuel like the giant it was, and early models could barely reach 75 miles into occupied France before they had to turn for home, abandoning the bombers they were meant to protect at the very edge of danger. The bombers flew on alone into the worst of the German defenses and were slaughtered. By 1944, with a sleeker, longer-legged fighter, the Mustang, arriving to take over the deep escort missions, the Army Air Forces actually threatened to shut Thunderbolt production down. The big fighter looked, for a moment, like a magnificent dead end. The man who had drawn it on a train refused to let it die. Kartveli and his team went back to the wing, the one part of the design they had never been able to fill with fuel, and built an entirely new one. They extended each wing at the root and packed fresh tanks inside, raising the Thunderbolt's internal fuel load by half, to more than 550 gallons. They squared off the elegant elliptical wingtips, which had the unexpected bonus of improving the aircraft's roll, and they strengthened the landing gear to carry the colossal new weight. This was the P-47N, the final, longest-range Thunderbolt of them all, and the very aircraft described in the manual on our pilot's knee. With full internal fuel and drop tanks slung beneath it, the N could fly close to 2,000 miles. It was built for exactly one place on Earth, the vast, empty distances of the Pacific, where the bombers heading for Japan needed a fighter that could go all the way with them. At takeoff, loaded for such a mission, it weighed more than 10 tons, at the time a record for any single-seat, piston-engine fighter ever flown. So picture that takeoff. Jack runs the engine up against the brakes until the whole machine strains and shudders, releases, and begins the long, heavy roll down a coral runway hacked out of a Pacific island. The Thunderbolt does not leap into the air. It gathers itself, eats up runway, and finally, ponderously, flies. Then comes the climb, slow under all that weight, the formation forming up around him, wingman by wingman, until a column of fighters turns out over open water toward a horizon with nothing on it at all. The manual has a quiet line about flying in company that says more than its plainness suggests. Keep at least 2 in sight, always. Out here, the men around you are the only landmarks you have. What follows is the part of the mission no film ever quite captures, the hours of nothing. The Thunderbolt's gift was that it made those hours survivable. From islands like Saipan and Ieshima, the Thunderbolt groups of the 7th Air Force, and famously the 318th Fighter Group, which had pioneered these enormous flights, would launch on round trips of 1,500 miles or more, 8 hours strapped into a single seat, much of it spent simply staying alive against the cumulative small enemies of fatigue, cold, and arithmetic. At altitude, the temperature in the cockpit fell far below freezing, and Jack flew swaddled against it, breathing bottled oxygen through a mask because the air outside could no longer keep a man conscious. His world narrowed to the cramped confines of the seat, the endless drone of the engine, the slow crawl of the instruments, and the discipline of doing small things correctly hour after hour. Because out here, carelessness killed as surely as any enemy fighter. Fuel was a constant calculation. Burn too rich and you would not make it home. Lean too aggressively and you risked the engine. The manual devotes careful attention to leaning the mixture for maximum range, because over the Pacific, fuel was not a convenience. It was the difference between a returning pilot and a name read out at a memorial. Navigation, too, was a matter of life and death, with no roads or rivers below, only the relentless sameness of the sea. For that, the manual teaches the pilot to lean on the radio. Using VHF homing, he could call a ground or ship station, give his aircraft number, and be talked back onto a heading, a lifeline of voices reaching out across the emptiness to guide a lost man home. It is one thing to read about such a system in a book. It is another to need it, 400 miles out, with the fuel gauge falling and the light beginning to go. Somewhere along that endless leg, if the navigation held and the timing was good, the bombers would appear. First as specks against the haze, then as the great silver shapes of B-29 superfortresses, droning toward Japan in their tight defensive boxes. This was the entire reason the Thunderbolt was here. The reason for the new wing, the extra fuel, the 8-hour endurance. It existed to be there, over enemy territory, at the precise moment the bombers were most vulnerable, when the defending fighters climbed to meet them. Earlier in the war, over Europe, the absence of escort at exactly that moment had cost bomber crews their lives by the hundreds. The IN model had been created so that it would not happen again. The Thunderbolt pilot slid into position above and around the formation, scanning the sky, and waited for the enemy to rise. And the waiting, after so many hours alone, was its own particular kind of strain. And then, somewhere over the target, the 8 hours of nothing end in a few minutes of everything. Here, the Thunderbolt revealed the second half of its character. Built into its wings were 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, the heaviest standard armament of any American fighter of the war, a wall of fire that could saw an enemy aircraft in half or shred a locomotive, a truck, or a parked plane on the ground in a single pass. The manual's gunnery sections drill the discipline of it: the lead, the range, the short controlled bursts, the conservation of ammunition for the moment that counts. In a dive, the Thunderbolt was one of the fastest aircraft in the sky, so fast that it pushed into the strange, half-understood region near the speed of sound, where the controls grew heavy and the air itself seemed to fight back. And the Jug was among the first fighters whose pilots had to be warned about it. Against targets on the ground, the Thunderbolt was more fearsome still. Beneath its wings and belly, it could carry as much as 2,500 pounds of bombs, or a battery of high-velocity rockets. And in the Pacific, it brought a new and terrible weapon to the islands: tanks of jellied gasoline, napalm, which it spread in rolling walls of fire across enemy positions. From their coral airfields, the Thunderbolt groups flew thousands of these strikes, pounding airstrips, gun emplacements, shipping, and troops dug deep into the rock. One Central Pacific group alone, flying these missions for months on end, logged more than 5,000 combat sorties, dropped over 1,000 tons of bombs, and fired some 1,600 rockets. And when the chance for air combat came, the Jug seized it with both hands. Earlier in the Pacific War, over the jungles of New Guinea, a Thunderbolt pilot named Neil Kirby had shown what the aircraft could do in the right hands, shooting down 6 enemy aircraft in a single mission and earning the Medal of Honor. Now, in the last spring of the war, as waves of suicide aircraft hurled themselves at the Allied fleet off Okinawa, it was often Thunderbolts that climbed to meet them, breaking up the attacks before they could ever reach the ships. But for all its firepower and speed, the quality that the men who flew it trusted most was something the manual is almost too modest to spell out. The Thunderbolt could take a beating that would have destroyed any other fighter, and bring its pilot home anyway. The most famous proof of that came not in the Pacific, but over France 2 years earlier, and it is the kind of story that every Thunderbolt pilot knew by heart. In June of 1943, an American pilot named Robert Johnson was bounced by a swarm of German fighters and shot, in the space of a few terrible minutes, very nearly to pieces. His aircraft caught fire, fell into a spin, and somehow came out of it still flying. As he limped toward the coast, a lone German fighter pulled alongside and methodically emptied its guns into him, round after round hammering the Thunderbolt's fuselage. When Johnson finally landed, his crew counted the damage. There were 21 cannon shells in the airframe and more than 200 bullet holes. Johnson stopped counting at 200. The fighter was a write-off. But it had carried him home. The reason was written into the very architecture Cartvelli had drawn on that train. The air-cooled radial engine had no fragile cooling system to be punctured. A single bullet in the wrong place could doom a liquid-cooled rival, but the double Wasp could lose whole cylinders and keep turning. The pilot sat behind armor plate. And all that machinery filling the belly, the great mass of turbosupercharger ducting, formed a kind of cushion of metal between the enemy's fire and the man flying the plane. One German ace, examining what the Thunderbolt could absorb, remarked that it could swallow an astonishing amount of lead and had to be handled very carefully. Jack, reading his manual over the Pacific, did not need the book to tell him this. The legend traveled ahead of the aircraft. It was the reason a man could fly 8 hours toward the enemy's homeland and believe he would see his island again. And yet, for all that armor and redundancy, the Pacific posed one threat the manual could not engineer away: the ocean itself. Over Europe, a crippled Thunderbolt could often glide to a field or take to its parachute over friendly ground. Out here, there was no ground, only water, stretching past the horizon in every direction. If the great engine fell silent 400 miles from home, no amount of toughness could help. The book's emergency procedures turned instead to the parachute and the life raft, the survival radio and the die marker, and the grim arithmetic of being found in all that emptiness before thirst or the sea claimed you. The Thunderbolt, for all its strengths, was a poor swimmer, heavy, and apt to nose under if a pilot tried to set it down on the waves. So the book's counsel over open water leaned toward taking to the silk and trusting the rescue crews to come. Every pilot who flew these missions carried that knowledge quietly with him. It was the unspoken weight that sat beside the manual on his knee, and it was the reason the long, patient lessons on fuel and navigation mattered as much as the lessons on gunnery. The machine could survive almost anything the enemy could throw at it. The one enemy it could not outbuild was distance, and distance was exactly what the end had been created to defeat. This was the brilliance of the Thunderbolt. Not a single dazzling quality, but a stubborn, compounding excellence that the headlines of the war tended to overlook. While history remembered the sleeker Mustang, it was the Jug that did the grinding, unglamorous labor of winning an air war. Flown alongside the Mustang in the same skies, the Thunderbolt flew roughly twice as many sorties, dropped many times the weight of bombs, and was lost less often for every mission it flew. Across the European theater alone, Thunderbolts flew nearly 750,000 combat sorties and were lost at a rate of well under 1%, among the lowest of any Allied fighter, and a figure that meant, in human terms, that the men who flew it tended to survive. When the Mustang freed the Thunderbolt from escort duty, the Jug found its true calling down on the deck, as the most destructive ground attack fighter of the war, tearing apart the arteries of the German military. By the war's end, Thunderbolts had destroyed tens of thousands of railway cars, thousands of locomotives, and thousands of armored vehicles, and dropped well over 100,000 tons of bombs. More Thunderbolts were built than any other American fighter in history, more than 15,000 of them. And in the Pacific, the N model finally closed the circle, answering the one criticism that had nearly killed the design, escorting the great B-29 superfortresses on their long missions over Japan and carrying the war, at last, all the way to the enemy's doorstep. The fighter that could barely cross the English Channel in 1943 was, by 1945, crossing oceans. The manual, having taught its pilot to start, to climb, to navigate, to fight, and to endure, has one last lesson, because not every mission ends in daylight. Its section on night flying opens with a line of almost startling calm, telling the pilot that flying the Thunderbolt at night is much like flying anything else at night. Simple enough, if you know your business and take the ordinary precautions a careful person takes crossing a street in the dark. It is the voice of the whole book in a single sentence, unhurried, practical, quietly determined to bring you back. The pilot is told to know his radio aids before he goes, to adapt his eyes to the darkness, to carry a dependable flashlight and use it sparingly, and to have the ground crew confirm his lights before he ever leaves. And then, on the long return leg, fuel low, the day's adrenaline drained away into a bone-deep exhaustion, Jack flies home in the dark by the discipline the book has drilled into him, calling the homing station, listening for the voice that gives him a course, watching for the first faint smudge of his island against the black water. He lands the great fighter, rolls to a stop, and shuts the double wasp down. The propeller spins to silence. The book did its job. That book still exists. You can hold one today. Its cover worn, the restricted stamp faded, a library catalog number inked onto the corner of a manual that was once meant to be seen only by the men entrusted with the machine it describes. It is an ordinary object that was once extraordinary, the distilled, hard-won knowledge of an entire generation of engineers and instructors, written down so that a 22-year-old could climb into 10 tons of metal and bring it home. Every plain sentence in it stood in for a lesson learned the hard way, a crash investigated, a pilot lost so that the next one might live. When Jack closed the book and climbed down from the cockpit at the end of 8 hours, he carried its lessons in his hands and its discipline in his bones, and the next morning he would do it all again. And that, in the end, is the deepest truth of the Thunderbolt. It was a machine that asked almost nothing of its pilot that it could not survive on his behalf. Cartvelli's dinosaur, too big, too heavy, very nearly canceled, turned out to be exactly the aircraft the war needed, a fighter built not to be elegant, but to be unbreakable, and to give the man inside it every possible chance to walk away. 8 hours over the Pacific, in the loneliest seat in the sky, that was worth more than speed, more than grace, more than fame. It was worth everything.